right, looks like we can let our lobby in. So we'll admit all of our lovely, wonderful waiting audience as they come in. All right, good afternoon. Well, I guess good morning. Technically, it's 11:59 where I am. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all on. I see we've got many more people logging in, and that'll be continuing for the next couple of minutes. Before we get started, just a quick little intro. My name is Steve Keller. I'm the project developer and national speaker for Drug Free Kids Canada. And this afternoon, we will be beginning our presentation on Prom in the next couple of minutes or so. Just give people a few moments to get connected and join in there. So I'm going to make sure my screen is sharing. Everything is up to task. Terrific. Can you see my screen there, Susan?
Yes, I can.
Phenomenal. Looking all promish and stuff. I like it. All right. So we will get started. I'll say at about 2 minutes past the hour. I find a lot of people, they come on like right at noon. So it just gives them a couple minutes to make sure their audio and video are working. Now, as our audience does get connected, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat panel. You can even raise your hand. I'm more than happy to take any comments as they come along. I'll make sure to try to get to as many as I can as we go. If there's any that you have in mind that you want to ask at the end, I will stick around for a little while after the presentation concludes to take any remaining questions from our audience. And additionally, if you do have any questions or would like to learn any more about the program that we offer here at DFK or the various programs that we offer, you can get in touch with us. I'll give you my email here just in the chat panel. skeller@dfk-jsd.org. You can also get in touch with our direct info link, which I will send at the end of the presentation as well. We've got quite a few people still logging in, I see. It's good to see. Welcome, everyone. So for those of you just joining, welcome again. My name is Steve Keller, project developer for DFK Canada. We will start the presentation in about another minute or so. I'm just giving you a few more moments to get logged in. All right. As the rest of our audience get logged in, I suppose we can get started along with the presentation. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today for the special presentation to help both guide and prepare parents as well as individuals involved in youth lives for supporting their teens during prom and graduation season. Now, you'll see this presentation is titled A Prom to Remember, and we'll get into the reason why that is in a moment. But this is a discussion that I found can be quite helpful for parents, whether that's looking at prom season, whether that's looking at graduation in grade 12, even for parents with middle schoolers going in grade 7, grade 8, moving on to high school, having these discussions about these sort of important transitional celebrations in a teen's life and some of the potential pressures or issues or I'll say substances or subjects of concern that can come up. I mean, for those of you listening, perhaps you have a teen who's about to go to prom. Maybe you have a teen who recently has been to one. Maybe you've got a kid that's going to be going in another couple years. Whatever the situation, we know these youth are about to celebrate one of the most exciting times of their high school life. We want to make sure that this is an evening that they will remember for all the right reasons, all the positive reasons, and all of the enjoyable reasons. Okay? So our vision at DFK is to ensure that all young people are able to live their lives free of risks or harms responsible or connected to problematic substance use and addiction. Sometimes people hear the title of our program and they believe that we're here to promote abstinence-only approaches. That's not the case. We understand that when it comes to substance use, abstinence is certainly a choice. However, if abstinence programs were the only effective method of programming, then we wouldn't have ongoing issues with alcohol and substances because no one would use them. We understand and we are working to build a movement that encourages and supports parents to prevent and reduce the harms of problematic drug use by youth. And as we know, approximately 9 out of 10 people that live with issues related to addiction or dependency actually begin using their substances in adolescence. This is why I offer these presentations to support those who are working with youth. Think of it like a helpline for helplines to support the parents, to support the teachers, to support the guardians, to support the care providers, the social workers, the child and youth workers listening today, the program staff, any professional who is reaching out to and working with youth. We're there to help. Now, we mentioned that this presentation does gear towards prom as well as other topics, but with prom in mind, I do have a question for you just to kind of get the ball rolling. And you can put your response in the chat panel if you would like. It is a question based on a survey conducted by the American Automobile Association back in 2022. Do you know how many teens in the US between the ages of 16 to 19 actually reported it is likely that they or their friends will be under the influence of drugs and or alcohol during prom season? Do you believe it's 15%, 25, 30, or 50%? I see a vote for 30, a vote for 50, 50, 50. Got some high numbers here. Always interesting. No one ever guesses the low numbers, right? We look at the high numbers. And in this situation, it would be wise to do so. We know that approximately 30% or nearly 1/3 of teens do say that either they are expecting they will be under the influence or their friends will be under the influence. So in other words, we know that not only is substance use reported, but it's widely expected. And if we extend a little bit further to look at research both in the US as well as in Canada, we know that just over half of teens actually report high risk drinking on prom night. That would be 4 or more alcoholic beverages. And in case you're wondering, that's about 2.5 times the national average of Canadians who report doing so at any other time of the year, coming in around 1 in 5. Now, drinking higher amounts of alcohol, we know exposes a person to greater physical risks, including alcohol poisoning, passing out, hangovers, impaired driving, and hospitalization. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Now, not only does alcohol consumption increase during prom season, but teens actually report that they feel more pressured to try drinking as well. Approximately 74% or 3/4 say that they feel pressured by their peers to try drinking on prom night, and about half or 49% say that they feel pressured by their friends to try drugs on prom night. Prom in itself is supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to be entertaining, enjoyable. But this can be a very stressful event, not just for the parents who are thinking about their kids, but the kids themselves. The added stress of peer pressure on a highly regarded night like this can weigh heavily on someone's well-being. This is where parents and guardians have a role. This is where care providers have a role in these conversations. You have that opportunity to take the time before prom to talk about how alcohol, cannabis, opioids, stimulants, sedatives, drug use in general can impact your teen. And what this workshop is designed to do is to help you understand how to do exactly that. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, many of you have seen presentations that I've done in the past whereby we talk about a specific substance or a collective of substances. And we try to organize the conversation by the trends in the substance, the risks, the potential harms, harm reduction strategies, as well as supports of where you can learn a little bit more information. This presentation is a little bit different. This is not a workshop to talk about a specific drug. In order to streamline this discussion, what we've actually done is we've organized the presentation into the event itself. So thinking about conversations before prom itself, in the weeks that lead up. What about the day of prom? What about the day of the event, the day of the grad, the day of the party? What are some of the things that have to come up there? And furthermore, if we're looking at a function like prom or like a grad, we know a common practice for teens is to go to an after party. So we have to talk about what happens in the back half of the night. Not just the spectacle or the glam of having fun at the event early on in the night, but also what goes on at those after parties. So in that first section, we're going to think about what we need to talk about with the teen before any of these. We're going to discuss who parents and guardians want to make sure to contact beforehand, as well as the conversation strategies that can help further the conversation with their teen. When we talk about prom itself, we're going to talk about some of those topics that we need to discuss in that regard. These include things like sober transportation, the rules of the school, as well as laws surrounding drug use and alcohol as at a school function or any social function, prom being included in this. Now, the third point, when we talk about the after party, here's where we're going to talk about some of the things, including strategies to stay safe, some of the risks of mixing substances together that we do see happen at many parties, signs of an overdose or signs of we'll say, substance poisoning or alcohol poisoning, as well as strategies that you can help prepare your teen to respond in case of emergency. And again, we have a final section for questions and comments, but as I said, you can ask anything during the presentation. I will do everything in my power to try to answer as best as I can. But let's get started with the lead up, shall we? Not all conversations can be scripted. When I build a presentation, when I build a slide deck, when I kind of put together the content for presentations, I'm going to pull the curtain back here a bit. I often have blocks of information in the presenter notes, and this is something that many of us do. We cannot script a conversation with a team the way I can try to build a presentation like this. But if you have an idea of who you need to speak with, what subjects you hope to cover, and the expectations or the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve, these can help shape those discussions. There's not a one-size-fits-all conversation, but in this section, we will examine these topics, as well as where you can go to learn more about substance use in general to help prepare yourself. Now, I have an open question for the audience here. I'm talking a lot about discussion. I'm talking a lot about conversation. I'm talking a lot about talking, right? In this lead up to prom, who are some of the people that you might want to talk with about the day at hand? I'll give you a hint. The first one is the most obvious. We want to have a conversation with our teens, right? But who else can we talk to? Where else can we go for advice? Where else can we go to feel support? Who are some people that we know or some people directly around us that we can connect with when it comes to lead up to prom? You can think about this one for a moment. Again, most of the conversation will happen with your teen. But who else can you speak with? Other parents within the community. I love that response. So if we start off with the conversation with teens, we know those are the most important conversations that are going to be held. As a parent or guardian, you want to keep these conversations casual. You frame them as a two-way conversation. Discuss your feelings about substance use and listen to what they have to say. And we'll discuss this further in the next few slides. Now, you mentioned other parents in the community. I really like that. Partner and spouse. This is a great response. Now, if you're hosting a party, if you are going to be hosting the party yourself, you want to consider reaching out to other parents that have hosted parties in the past. This is where we often talk about this idea of sort of building your network of connections, right? Your kids have friends, get to know their friends' parents. Have conversations, and you've been doing this for a long time. This is not something new. But if you know your teen is going to a party at a friend's house on the other side of town, being able to connect with the parents and ask sort of, what are the expectations? When are they expecting people to be there? How long are they expecting to keep them around? And if you're hosting, and you've never hosted a party before, it helps to connect with other parents and ask what their experiences have been. What are some of the boundaries? I love that response there, Mercedes. But what are some of the boundaries that they set? What were some of the things that they saw in perhaps adverse or unfortunate situations? Did they deal with any emergencies? What were some quick responses they had to make? Now, some of these may be very simple. It could be as simple as if they're putting out food, do they have to consider any allergies? These sound very simple. But when we get to the more complicated ones, how have they responded in a situation whereby someone's had too much to drink or someone showed up using substances? It helps to be able to reach out to the experience of others to help inform ourselves. Like I said, a lot of this starts as a conversation with your teen, but you yourself may be feeling unsure. You yourself may have concerns, and it helps to connect with the people that you trust around you to help frame your conversations. I love that, being aware of the age of the guest. That's a pretty good one too. Having a prom after party, inviting a lot of people, 16, 17, 18, a lot of people kind of in that high school age. Chances are if you got a bunch of other parents showing up that are our age, might be a different conversation to be had. Now, one that gets forgotten, but is very important to consider, is the transportation. So, if your teen is planning on using a limo company, if your teen is planning on accessing a taxi service, it's important that you have the opportunity to speak with the company as well and ask what their policies are on alcohol consumption. Do they allow alcohol in the vehicle? They shouldn't for underage individuals, but there are limo companies that don't allow alcohol at all. With taxis, it's important to ensure that the driver knows sort of when you're hoping to have them picked up. When are they being dropped off? Confirm these schedules beforehand. That's not only just a focus on safety, but it helps create structure for your team so that they feel more organized about the evening. If they know that their limo's picking them up at this time, if they know they're going to a party at this point, if they know the cab is coming home at that point, that gives them a little bit more structure to work with. It gives them a little bit more security. This can be a stressful time. Take away some of that unpredictability. Helps create a little more comfort for many of them, right? Now, what if they have a friend who's acting as a designated driver, rather? Well, this is an opportunity to get to speak with them. We know it's common for parents and guardians to book limousines, but we also know that if your teen has a peer or friend who's their designated driver, you can let that person connect with you as well, in case they need support, or if their plans for being the designated driver change. In many workshops, in many discussions with communities, I often talk about sober driving, designating sober driving. And we talk about the importance of giving your teen choices and allowing them to explain what those choices are for getting a sober ride home. But one point I find that's quite effective to bring up as well is having a backup plan. If they've booked with a limo company, if they've booked with a taxi service, and there's a complication on the service's end, or for some reason there's conduct that occurs that makes that taxi company cancel the service, or if they've booked with a designated driver, set up a plan with a DD, and that driver stays and drinks, or that driver leaves early, or that driver has a full vehicle, it helps to ask your teen what their backup plan is. And before you talk with your teen about substances, you also want to make sure that you prepare yourself. So before starting this conversation, you need to reflect on your own readiness to speak with your teen. Know what kind of skills and practices do you need to make sure that this conversation can be productive, non-judgmental, and have more positive outcomes? I've got a list. The first one is the importance of staying calm, right? Tell yourself you're not going to lose it with your teen. Anger and hostility aren't going to get you anywhere in a conversation. You want to stay as calm as possible. Remember, you are the parent. You are the provider. You're the care provider. You're the guardian. You're the professional. You're the individual that's supporting them. You can take the lead. You want to be kind. You want to be simple. You want to be direct in your statements. And above all else, remember that they want you to still care. Remind them that you still care. You are there to support them, even if substance use is involved. I've heard stories, parents saying in the past that, if they think their child is using substances, they'll tell them don't come home. Well, what's that going to do? That can just expose them to many more unsafe situations. You want to let them know that you still support them. And if they've used substances, if they feel unsafe or if they feel unwell, they need to know that they can call you. Be positive. This doesn't mean that you celebrate choices people make if you feel that they're unsafe. That's not the point of being positive. The point of being positive is keeping your message positive and keeping your response positive. If you approach a situation with shame, anger, scare tactics, disappointment, worst case scenarios, these efforts are going to be counterproductive. We've actually seen scare tactics tend to push kids away. They make them feel uncomfortable. Instead, what you want to do is you want to focus on being attentive, focus on being curious, respect their opinions and their experiences in these conversations, and try to show understanding. And sometimes that can mean saying that I don't understand. I want you to teach me more. I'm trying to learn more. I'm trying to see more of your perspective. You want to engage with them. You want to find a comfortable setting, right? Lectures don't work with kids. I say as I'm lecturing a group right now. What we want to do is we want to have engagement. We want to have conversation. Again, this is why I invite you to ask me questions as we go. And finding a comfortable setting is a great place to do this. If you announce a sit-down meeting with your teen in the lead up to prom and say, we need to have a talk after dinner, it's rather going to be met with resistance. While a more spontaneous or casual approach will usually lower a child's anxiety and maybe even your own. Thinking about those situations when you feel calm, thinking about those situations when things are going well. These are great opportunities to have conversations that can be a little bit more complicated. And if they become more complicated, if they become heated, you can acknowledge your emotions and say, I think it's best if we take a break right now. You have that time with your teen. You have that youth that you work with. You want to show that empathy, and you want to be willing to say if that conversation is feeling more like a confrontation, we still want to talk about this later, but let's take a break right now. We don't want this to be a fight. We're not intending for this to come out like a fight. Let's come back when we feel a little more calm. Give it a few hours, give it a day or two. You'll know that time, and you'll be able to set that up with your teen. In doing so, you're helping to not only establish trust, but you're helping to maintain it. It also helps to stay in the know. Even knowing a little bit about substance use can help make you feel more comfortable. That's what you're doing today. You joined in on a presentation to learn about substances. Pertaining directly to events like prom, but you're still learning about substance use. We're going to chat a lot about it in the next 45 minutes. And if you feel that you don't know enough, you're having a conversation with a teen about drugs, about cannabis, about vaping, about alcohol, about opioids, whatever the topic is, you can mention that. This isn't something I know a lot about. It's okay to be a little vulnerable. Invite your teen to share their knowledge. And if they're unsure, this is an opportunity to invite the opportunity to look into it together. Don't just say, go find out and come back to me. Instead, what you want to say is, why don't we look at this together? I saw this great resource from Cannabis and Mental Health. I saw this great resource from the Cannabis Awareness Program. I saw this great resource from CMHA. I saw this great resource from DFK. It's an opportunity for you to get to talk about that together and engage together. Keep it casual. Ask your teen when is a good time to talk. I have to cover formal subject matter, but if I come in too formally, it can be off-putting. Quite often when I do presentations, I'll wear something like a polo shirt, not something too formal. I don't come in with a full jacket and tie when I'm engaging with a community. That can be off-putting. So instead, I try to come in a little more calm, a little more conversational. And if you get a negative response in your conversation, you want to try again later. That's okay. I want to talk about this, or would you like to talk about this? Are you free to talk about this? If the answer is no, try again later. Don't give up, don't dismiss it, but give them time. Make your expectations clear. How do you do that? I've got a list here you can try. If you're beginning an ongoing conversation about substance use, you can express concern. And we'll talk about the difference between concern and other responses a little later. You also want to gauge how a youth feels about substance use. You may have a teen that you're working with or that you're speaking with or that you're living with that they feel very against substance use. They may abstain completely. They may not have any interest in having a conversation about substance use because they don't have an interest in it. It's still okay to speak about substances and even reaffirm why they may choose not to use many of these substances. If they wish to avoid health risks, if they wish to avoid complications, if they wish to avoid being involved in risky situations, that's okay to bring that up. To say it's a great thing that they're aware of that. It's a great thing they're considering that. By contrast, if you have a youth that's, maybe discloses that they do use substances or that many of their friends use, this is an opportunity to ask their feelings about that. Maybe some of the intentions behind why they use or why they believe their friends are using. Invite them to keep speaking. And you can also learn about the pressures that they may be facing with drugs. I mentioned a few slides ago that prom does tend to be a point of the year that many teens feel pressured to try drugs. So this is an opportunity just to say at the beginning of the conversation, here's why I want to talk about this. I learned today there's elevated pressure around substance use at prom time. This is why we want to have this conversation. Practice and be flexible. Consider the use of non-judgmental language. More on that in the next two slides. Use open-ended questions. Avoiding yes/no questions is quite effective in having a conversation with youth because if you ask yes or no questions, it ends a conversation before it begins. When you encourage an open-ended conversation, how they feel about something, what they think about something, what knowledge they have, share them to or invite them to share, or explain further. This encourages your teen to share more information voluntarily. Many meetings I have, that's what I do. I avoid asking yes/no questions. Now, when I'm presenting to you, I have some true or false multiple choice questions to get quick engagement. But you'll notice that I'll ask many open-ended questions. What do we know? What do we think? Why do we think that? Because I'm inviting you to share more. A couple slides ago, I asked one open-ended question. I had like 9 people respond right away. Keep them open-ended. Offer empathy, offer compassion. Someone mentioned that. They talked about patience and compassion. You want to show your teen you're trying to understand how they feel. It's okay if you don't understand, and it's okay to tell them I don't understand. I don't understand. I'd like you to keep speaking. I'm trying to understand. Being a good listener does not mean you have to understand everything someone tells you. And if you try to force yourself to understand, you're just going to make them feel like you're dismissing them. When they share, you want to listen, you want to ask questions, and summarize what you hear. Now, what about the language itself? Some of you have maybe heard in other presentations, we've talked about the importance of considering the word and the verbiage that you use. Certain words that you use can have negative connotations or influence over an entire conversation. Consider words like bad or stupid. Smoking weed can cause a person to make bad choices. Heavy drinking is stupid. What are some words you could use instead of bad, stupid? Well, if you're wondering why these words don't fit, the reason is what they do is they associate morality with a decision. When you associate morality, if I say smoking is bad, if I say cocaine is bad, if I say drinking is bad, that creates morality. And if a youth is using or they know someone that's using, to them it sounds like you're saying they're bad. And you're creating sort of this conflict between the two of you. Same with calling it stupid. That sounds judgmental. If someone drinks heavily, that makes them stupid. You're insulting their intelligence. Scarlett, I see you bring up unhealthy. That's a great term. Even harmful, right? Getting high, smoking weed can cause a person to make harmful choices, risky choices. Now you've taken morality out, but you've identified there's a risk there. Risk isn't good or bad. It's not a moral decision. It's highlighting that there's something there that could have an adverse effect. Harmful decisions, harmful choices can have an adverse effect. They're not bad. They're not morally wrong. but they can lead to unfortunate or negative situations. Heavy drinking is unhealthy as opposed to saying stupid. When you use the words on the left, you're creating judgment and you're trying to identify the person in that regard. If you use words like harmful or unhealthy, you've taken judgment out of the conversation and you've invited more discussion. What about disapproval? I disapprove. I don't approve of that group you hung out with after prom. I'm disappointed that you got home later than you said you would. Prom ended at 11. The after party was over at 2. You didn't get home till today at noon. I'm disappointed in you. Those can be some heavy terms for a teen. What are some words we can use instead? How about worried? I like worried. Worried's a great word. It's not that I'm disappointed. What you can do in this situation, when we use words like disapproval and disappointment, they come across as condescending and they come across as judgmental. If I don't approve of something you do, I'm making a judgment call on your life and saying it's beneath me. If I'm disappointed in something that you do, I've judged you and I've already said you're guilty at that moment. Think about why you disapprove. Think about why you're disappointed. It's the emotions behind that that matter more. These responses can be caused by concern and by worry. And those are the words that reflect that you care. It's not that I'm disappointed you got home, it's that I was worried about you. We often say when we work with young people, when we educate, when we have kids, and we're working with teens, we often hear them referred to as a vulnerable sector. There's a vulnerability that we have on our end as well, and it's okay to show that. It's okay to show a little bit of humanity there and say, I was concerned. You know, I was worried. I wanted to make sure you were safe. I'm concerned about your friends. I'm concerned about the group that you were connecting with there. I worry they may not have the best influence on your behavior. That invites more of a conversation. According to a drug-free kids tracking study conducted in 2022, which of these were considered by teens to be the most reliable source of information about drugs? Is it parents, school, online social media websites, or friends? What do we think? And in case you're wondering, it was actually the same in 2020. It's been the same answer twice that we've seen. Social media, friends, parents, friends. You know, it's interesting. If you ask teens where they see it the most, they'll say social media or they have conversations with their friends. But if you ask where they get the most reliable response, it's actually their parents. About 2/3 of teens surveyed in our tracking studies say that they get information that they trust from their parents. We know that during teenage years, the influence of friends and peers cannot be overstated. It is something they're around their friends all the time. We want them to be. We want them to have an active social life. But our research suggests that teens still trust the advice about substance use from their parents the most, including social media, internet, peers, and school. So the conversations that you have as a care provider, those are what resonate with them. Again, that catches a lot of people off guard. They usually look at it the other way around because that's what we would think from what we see. But when we actually speak with youth, it's the people they spend the most time with, and that's their parents, that's their family. Now, what exactly can I say? I told you at the beginning of this section, there's no script in a conversation. If your youth is using, or you're suspecting that you're using, they're concerned about your use, or they've highlighted a concern about their use, it is hard to say this is exactly what I'm going to say to you. We understand that. We also know that no parent or guardian is expected to know every single thing about drugs. What we invite you to do is start the conversations from where you're at and meet your teen where they're at. Language that comes up a lot in the social service sector, the education sector, the childcare sector, child and youth sector. It's that importance of meeting them where they're at. And we have a great resource on our website called the Parent Support Hub. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a wonderful resource that you can actually access 24/7, totally free. It connects parents to a health professional that can help them sort of guide them through these discussions or through some of their concerns. And what we can actually do through this service is connect them with a professional for up to 5 free counseling sessions for either themselves and their child as well. To learn more, you can visit our website, drugfreekidscanada.org, and click on our sweet, wonderful, beautiful icon of the Parent Support Hub, which you will find on the top left corner of the page. Now let's talk about prom itself, right? We've had this lead-up conversation, these strategies before we even have the conversation. Now, prom and grad are a time for teens to celebrate. It's time to party. We want the night to be memorable. We've talked about this before. So before your teen heads off to prom, there's a few things you want to make sure they consider. They want to consider pre-drinking, the conversations around that, sober driving, as well as school rules and laws. And we're going to talk about all three of them. Now, if we start with pre-drinking, why do you think that teens might drink or use drugs before going to an event like prom? What do you think? What might be some factors that might play into their decision specifically at prom before they go? What do you think? To fit in? Okay. Have more fun? Okay. Peer pressure, fun, anxiety, nervousness. So if we look specifically at prom, there's kind of three reasons that we've seen pop up in various resources, and I'll show you all three of them. The first one is the idea of fun and pleasure. We often hear this in any conversation about substance use. The second is the idea they can't use substances at the event. Pre-drinking, sometimes you hear it as pre-gaming. This is a practice we see adults do, that we see young adults use, college-age youth use, even if they can legally drink. They don't want to go out to a bar or a party because maybe they can't afford the drinks that are there, so they drink at home. They try to save some money. Or they're going to an event whereby alcohol is not being served. They can't drink there, so they drink at home first. This is a similar mentality to high school students when they're considering their prom or considering their grad. Obviously, a school function will not be supplying alcohol to underage youth. So if your teen is planning or intending to use drugs, doing so at prom may get them in trouble with the school or with police in some situations. So they may want to drink at home or at a friend's house. Finally, we have managing stress and anxiety. Think about the amount of planning, the money spent, and the social aspects of prom. There's the suits, there's the dresses, there's the circumstances, there's the development, there's the pre-planning, there's the food, there's the catering, there's the travel, there's the after party if they're hosting. What if they're on the planning committee for the prom? There's all of those factors they have to consider there. There's cost, there's budgeting, there's considering an outlet. Think about any major event you've had to plan in your life, right? They do this because they're stressed. Couple all of that anxiety with an upcoming graduation, the thought of going to college, university, moving away from home. That's on the back of their mind. So using drugs or alcohol may serve as a coping mechanism for teens who wish not to think about those things. Or they may feel these substances help with their anxiety. Well, if you're discussing pre-drinking, what are some things we can ask to really reframe those thoughts? Well, the first one is, what are you looking forward to the most at prom? Ask your teen to think about what makes the event so special. Could be the friends, the food, the dancing, food. I said food twice. I like food. Spectacle, or simply the joy of going to a party to celebrate. Whatever the reason, you can then ask them how they think alcohol or drugs might affect those things. For example, drinking before the event might spoil their appetite for dinner or render them clumsy or uncoordinated on the dance floor, leading to embarrassing or harmful outcomes if they fall. I have seen the shoes, I have seen the heels that get worn at these events. Trying to dance on one of those after a few drinks, I could imagine would be quite difficult. I don't think that I could pull off a pair of high heels like that. I would probably fall over several times. If they're looking forward to a night out with friends, using cannabis or alcohol may cause them not to remember as much as they normally would. We talk about this being memorable. Substances like cannabis, substances like sedatives, substances like alcohol can impair a person's memory. They may black out and not even remember how the night went. And finally, using stronger drugs like opioids or stimulants may result in them taking a trip to the hospital instead of the after party. So you ask them the things they're looking forward to really engage them on those interests. Second is to consider the school drug and alcohol use. We mentioned earlier that youth may use drugs or drink before prom because they can't do so at the event. Now, if they get caught drinking, if they get caught using drugs, if they get caught bringing them in, they may be sent home, suspended, or deemed unable to attend any remaining events in the school year. And in some situations, they may even face criminal charges for things like possession or trying to buy or sell drugs at the event. Third, if a teen cites stress or anxiety going through their mind, we invite them to talk about coping. What are some other ways that you can manage stress? What are some healthy alternatives to consider? If a teen highlights they're feeling stressed about prom, they're feeling nervous about prom, this is a great opportunity not just to talk about drugs, but to talk about healthy coping mechanisms. Ask what else helps them feel better. Ask what else they do to enjoy themselves. Listen to their responses and ask questions to encourage the conversation further. If this stress is ongoing or causing them other health-related concerns, you can help them connect with their doctor or healthcare provider as well to see if there's maybe something else going on. And finally, it's very important to remember that giving alcohol or drugs to a teen is illegal, and anyone who provides alcohol or drugs in their home or allows substance use can be held liable for their guest. Case in point, if a teen or a group of teens are drinking at a friend's parents' house, there's an awareness there that they're drinking. One of them is driving to prom, they get behind the wheel of the car, they get partway there, they get pulled over, charged with an impaired driving, or get involved in a collision. The host is partially liable for that individual leaving. So it's important, especially if it's a teen, it's important to remember the laws, not just for kids, but for parents as well. You cannot give alcohol or drugs to a teen. And if they are consuming in your house, you are responsible to make sure that they do not get behind the wheel of a vehicle. According to the Government of Canada in 2022, the percentage of Canadian drivers killed in vehicle crashes who test positive for alcohol alone is lower than those who test positive for drugs. What do we think? Or higher. I meant to say blank. Lower, see vote for lower. Lower. We have a lot of conversations about alcohol impaired driving. Is it still number one? Is drug impaired driving higher? What do we think? Well, the answer here is actually lower. And we've seen this even in specific provinces. In Ontario and in New Brunswick, for instance, we've actually seen that alcohol impaired fatalities have actually become lower than drug impaired fatalities on the road. So we still have to remember that impaired driving is the leading cause of criminal death for teens in Canada. It's higher than homicide. It's higher than any other criminal cause. And in the US, we know that the number of impaired fatalities among teens is actually the highest at over 30% during that 6-week prom graduation season. But yet, despite that, over 80% of teens say they would rather drive impaired than call for a sober ride home. Why is that? Why do teens avoid calling their parents for a ride home? What do we think? Fear of being in trouble. This is fear of consequence. Okay, what else? Because they don't want to get in trouble. They think they can drive. Absolutely. Peer pressure. There's a peer factor there. You know, don't worry about calling. Just drive. You're fine. You're fine. They feel weak. They feel embarrassed. Absolutely. Research actually suggests many different reasons here, and one of them is that fear of getting in trouble for being impaired. Again, this goes back to that conversation that parents may have or they've had in the past, whereby they say, if you get drunk, if you get high, don't come home. So they don't want to make that call because they're too embarrassed to make it. Other teens who drive or get into a vehicle with a cannabis impaired driver may believe that cannabis is not as risky or dangerous to consume before driving as alcohol is. Now, whatever the reason, it's crucial to ensure that your teen is aware of the risks of impaired driving and that they do plan a safe way of travel. Now, how do we do that? Well, you want to ask them some questions. You want to ask, how do you think alcohol affects driving skills? They've learned this in school, they've seen commercials, they've seen PSAs, but ask them what they know. What skills can be impacted by the presence of alcohol in the body? Another fascinating one is cannabis. Back around the time of legalization, we know that about a quarter of Canadians over the age of 24 said that they thought cannabis either had no impact on their driving skills or made them a better driver. And you'll hear people say this. They'll say that they feel they're a better driver when they consume cannabis. To that, I often ask, what are they better at doing? In many cases, they'll say, well, they see the road better. They focus better. Well, then you have to ask them, what other skills are involved in driving beyond focus? Is it focusing on one thing? Cannabis impairs the brain's ability to multitask. So if they say, well, I see the road better when I'm impaired, that would be like saying I see this teacup that I'm drinking my green tea out of better. I can explain the color and the letter and the tea bag in it and the color of the tag and the text on the bottom. I might forget that I'm presenting because my ability to multitask has been impaired by the presence of THC from cannabis. But I can hyperfixate on one thing. So if I drive, I may see the road better, but I won't see a car in front of me as well. I won't see a pedestrian. I won't see an animal jump out in front of me as quickly. I may not see a light change color as quickly. I may not respond to changes in the weather, sudden noise on the radio, someone speaking to me in the car, if my dog's in the back seat, maybe sticking his head forward, trying to lick my face. All of these things go on when a person's driving. Cannabinoids are one of the most commonly found substances in dead and injured drivers in Canada. And a common misconception is that they believe there's no impact of cannabis on driving. So asking that question about those skills is a great way to help youth consider that. Ask them what time they plan to be home, because we know that having a realistic curfew set and agreed upon between the parent and the teen is considered a protective factor. And finally, asking again, how do they plan to travel and what is their backup plan? Work together with your teen. Help them set up their travel plans. If they feel embarrassed, they say, maybe they're not comfortable calling you. Okay. You still present yourself as an option, but ask them what other options they have and what other options they will use. Give them alternatives, or better yet, ask them what they are. Because if they have to recite them to you, they're more likely to reach out to them. True or false? School officials can search a student's property, for example, a bag or a purse, at prom if they have reasonable grounds to suspect that a school rule or law is being violated. What do we think? False? What do we think? True. True, false? Bit of a divide here. This is actually true. And in fact, there was a really interesting case study about this back in 2019. I'll talk a little more about it in a moment. Prom is supervised and supported in many situations by your teen school. They have faculty on hand, they have teachers on hand. Some may work with off-duty police, some may work with other chaperones to ensure a safe space. And as such, the rules and expectations are consistent with a regular school day and any other social event. Students can be suspended or even face criminal charges for their actions at prom if they choose to bring alcohol or drugs in for the event. For example, as we actually saw this happen a couple of years ago in 2019, an Ontario student was found in possession of cocaine and charged after her bag was checked at a security line at the hall where prom was taking place. In a situation like prom, this is similar to going to a Jays game or a Leafs game or a concert. If you have a bag, if you have a purse, security may ask to do a quick check of it. Open up the bag, take a quick look inside. This is a voluntary search. They will not charge you if you say no, but they can ask you to leave. They can deny you entrance, or at very least, they can ask you to take the bag away and come back without the bag, come back without the purse. In this situation, the student was in a line waiting to go in. They knew that there was going to be a check. They were asked to show the inside of their purse, which they did. They opened the purse up. School vice principal saw a small metal straw in the student's bag, which aroused suspicion because it was an oddly specific item, which prompted a further examination leading to the discovery of cocaine. Now, the student's defense attempted to have the case thrown out as a violation of her right to privacy, to which the Ontario court ruled that while the student had an expectation of privacy, this was lessened given the situation in that the school's mandate was to ensure the safety and security of the attendees. The student chose to attend an event where prohibited substance use was obviously not allowed, particularly illicit substances, and therefore her bag was eligible to be searched if there were reasonable grounds for doing so. And the court ruled that there was. Why do I bring all this up? It's not just to say, oh, check it out, I read about law. It's not that. It's to remind your student and to remind anyone, if you're going to an event like prom, if you're going to a concert, if you're going to a sporting event, if you're going to anything whereby you are going to be out in public in a social situation, you still have to remember that school rules and laws apply. Being impaired at the event may result in an individual being denied entry or being asked to leave. And committing any offenses that go against school rules or laws can result in suspension, a barring from upcoming school events, grad, remaining trip, sporting events, or any legal offenses that are committed can result, in fact, in criminal charges. We don't focus or fixate too much on laws. We understand there's an importance of understanding legality, and this is something that we just want you to remember. Legal status does matter when it comes to discussing substances. It does. So it's important to just have that in mind. And what about the after party? We're coming up on the back half of the night, right? The end of prom for many people doesn't mean the end of the night. After parties are a common activity for young people. They keep the party going right through midnight, right into the morning. These events can be memorable. They can be a lot of fun, but they can also present some unique risks. So in this final section, we will examine those risks, as well as how to prepare your youth for both a safe and fun party experience. After party can be more exciting than prom for many people. It can be as exciting as prom for many people, but it presents situations that may not occur at prom. So here are some of the things we want to consider. We want to talk about helping your teen protect themselves. More on that in a moment. We'll talk about the risks of mixing alcohol and drugs together. We'll talk about signs of overdose or overconsumption, as well as how to respond to emergency situations effectively. Okay. Let's start with protection, helping your teen protect themselves. What am I talking about specifically here? This is one of the, I would say one of the most heavy parts of the conversation, but it's one that unfortunately does have to come up. Parties and social gatherings are commonplace during prom season. Teens celebrate a big rite of passage, but there are occasions where people may choose to engage in unsafe or harmful behaviors towards others. And an unfortunate example of this is sexual assault, which is seen as a higher risk during prom season. One American Medical Association study back in the early 2000s, and it's been hard to find specific numbers around this on prom, but this one kind of jumped off the page at me and I wanted to share it, was that 1 in 5 female high school students reports being the victim of a physical or sexual abuse on prom night. That's 20% of teens in a 6-week window, 20% of females. And in Canada, we know that over half of the victims of sexual assault know their perpetrator. We know that drug-facilitated sexual assault drugs, these include GHB or Rohypnol or roofies, can often be tasteless or odorless. And the risk of being victimized is certainly increased when alcohol and or drugs are involved. Research in the States from both the AMA as well as the National Institute on Drug Abuse finds that the majority of sexual assaults actually involve alcohol, including those during prom season. In Canada, approximately 30% of all women over the age of 15 have been sexually assaulted outside of an intimate relationship at least once since the age of 15, and over half of these victims know the perpetrator. And again, substance use and alcohol are commonplace in these assaults in Canada as well as in the US. Why is it we separate alcohol and other substances? This is a great question. Alcohol is by far the most commonly consumed psychoactive substance. It actually falls under the class of CNS depressants or sedatives. So if we were to be more technical, we would actually include it in a discussion on depressants. But as alcohol carries many different social norms, responses, prevalence, and a lot less, I'll say, stigma versus other drugs, this is why alcohol tends to have sort of its own discussion. The research on alcohol is far more expansive. The effects of alcohol, the risks of alcohol, the long-term harms of alcohol are much actually more well-known than many drugs that we cover. And in fact, we actually speak about alcohol at length, both on our website and in another one of our presentations from the Let's Talk Drugs series. But it's often why, I'm glad that you asked the question, it's why in this presentation on substance use, I always include alcohol. Any conversation I have about drugs, I include alcohol. Any conversation about alcohol, I include drugs, because they do need to sort of fall under the same class together. Alcohol is a drug. It's a substance. It's a CNS depressant. So it's a good question. But that's often why I see it separated, but it's also why I argue it should be brought in with the others. Now, when we look at sexual violence, sexual assaults, we know that alcohol is not the only drug to consider when discussing these. Date rape drugs, including gamma hydroxybutyrate or GHB or Rohypnol, are also powerful sedatives that may be used by sexual predators when spiking a drink of an unsuspecting victim. In a few slides, we're going to learn how to spot signs of an overdose, which will include this topic. But we also like to point out at this moment that using GHB, Rohypnol, or other drugs, including alcohol, to commit a sexual assault is not only dangerous and traumatic, but it is also illegal. Someone charged with using these drugs to commit a sexual assault can face up to 14 years in prison, plus any additional charges for sexual assault. So how do we support teens here? We want to focus on safety. We discuss the importance of protecting oneself. So it's important to focus on safety in these conversations. Otherwise, if you solely focus on talking about why they want to protect themselves, this can sound like victim shaming, or it can sound like it's being preemptively suspicious. We're not doing this to scare them. We're not doing this to guilt them. We're doing it because we want them to be safe. We focus on the safety element. I brought up the first half of the conversation with you because we need to focus on the second half. We talk about the importance of getting your own drink. Remind your teen to pour their own drink, get their own drink, and not share it with anyone else. Many sexual violence or sexual assault assisted drugs like GHB and Rohypnol, they're odorless, usually flavorless, although some can be a little bitter. It can be almost impossible to tell if a drink's been spiked. The most effective way to protect your teen in this situation is just make sure they pour their own drinks or get their own drinks or bring their own drinks while they're out. And if they leave a drink unattended, they should just dump it upon their return. We want to remind them to take breaks, hydrate, and eat food. Drinking too much alcohol, we know, can result in alcohol poisoning, leaving someone in a vulnerable state. It's important for your teen to avoid binge drinking or heavy drinking. However, we understand that this is a reality in many situations on prom night. So, if they choose to drink more than one alcoholic beverage, or 2 or 3 or however many, we recommend they take breaks from drinking throughout the evening. Take breaks to have water, take breaks to eat food, and check in for a little while to see how they're feeling half an hour after their last drink, an hour after their last drink, before they decide to have another one. We remind them to stay in public spaces with the people that they trust. After parties are often large group get-togethers. So one way to reduce the risk of being the victim of sexual assault is to stay with a group of friends that a teen trusts. Again, this way, if someone else begins to feel unwell, or if they begin to feel unwell, the group can work together to help them keep safe and contact emergency services if needed. And finally, here's where, again, we talked earlier about some teens may not feel comfortable calling home. We want to remind them that this is always an option. Your teen can always call home. They can always call supports. And that's why you set up those plans with them, those backup plans, those additional support plans, so that they know they have those if they feel unwell, or if they feel pressured to use drugs or pressured to drink. They're there to have a good time. And if they feel uncomfortable, if they don't feel well, it's not a good time. You can offer to help them get home so they can end their night feeling more at ease and feeling more safe. Using. Yes, absolutely. And that's the point I was getting around, and I'm glad you said it directly. Instead of telling our teens to check their drinks, it's still an important conversation to have, but we also need to teach them not to drug other people. This is why I like bringing up the legal ramifications there. That's why I like bringing up the importance of the risks, not just for the individual, but also the legal penalties and the legal ramifications for someone that does this. We still need to teach the importance of helping keep ourselves safe, but we do want to work towards, creating communities where people feel safe because they trust other people, because those other people are making the right choices. And that's exactly it. We can't control those situations, unfortunately. We want to. We really want to, but we can't. And that's why we have to teach both. We have to teach both. Absolutely. It is something that you kind of have to teach both those parts. Now, how much is too much? Using which of these substances can result in an overdose? Is it alcohol, opioids, cannabis, or all of the above? Which of these is it possible to overconsume or overdose? What do we think? All the above? Survey says absolutely all of the above. And I do agree the conversation's both ways. I'd even love to chat about it a little more at the end. I just want to make sure I get to the end. I don't want to avoid the conversation, but I'd be happy to chat about it at the end. The answer here is that it is all of the above. Now, before I show you lists of what signs of an overdose can look like, I'm going to ask the audience, can you identify signs that a person is experiencing harm? A sign that a person's had too much to drink? Let's start with alcohol. What are some physical, behavioral, psychological signs that a person has consumed more alcohol than they can handle? What do we think? The person's unconscious. Absolutely can happen. Loss of balance. Slurring their words. Got a nice long list here. I'm not expecting that your teen is going to remember every single one of these. Thank you, Mercedes. I'm glad you were able to join today. The recording will be up. You'll be able to access it too. Now, signs of overconsumption of alcohol and other depressants, going back to that idea alcohol needs to be included in drug conversations. Signs of overconsumption can include dizziness, nausea, stupor, vomiting, dehydration, slow breathing, weakness, headache, slurred speech, passing out, coma, reduced heart rate. And these are just in the short term. In other presentations I do get into more detail on like the short and long-term health risks of alcohol. Today, we're just talking about those actual signs of overconsumption. Now, what about cannabis? Well, cannabis, we have dizziness, heart palpitations, fever, nausea, vomiting, difficulty with breathing, dehydration, delusions, hallucinations, difficulty with memory, judgment, and problem solving. Now, I put psychotic episodes here, but you'll notice I put a couple asterisks next to this. Cannabis use and psychosis do not have an exact linear connection in that every single person that uses cannabis, there used to be this myth that went around that everyone that used cannabis would develop psychosis or schizophrenia. We know that's not true. However, we do know that there is a link between individuals with vulnerability to psychotic breaks, psychosis, and schizophrenia and cannabis use, particularly teens, particularly people that use higher levels of THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, which we explained in other presentations. This is a possibility, particularly with people with vulnerabilities to this condition. So I have it included, but this is not to say that every single person that overconsumes will experience this. Signs of overconsumption of opioids include clammy skin, pinpoint pupils, drowsiness, passing out, slowed breathing, inability to breathe, or no heartbeat. And if we add stimulants into the list here, these can be things like methamphetamine, cocaine, even prescription stimulants like Ativan or Ritalin. These can include things like seizure, psychotic episode, hyperthermia, labored breathing, convulsions, coma, high blood pressure, heart attack, and stroke. Now, no two people are going to show the exact same signs all the time. What's important to do here is to remind your teen and to advise them that they need to call emergency services if they or someone they know is using substances and begins to experience any of these effects, even if they don't know the person's using them. This is an opportunity to make sure that you're supporting safety here. Okay? Now, anytime I discuss naloxone, I always have a slide on, or anytime I discuss opioids, I always have a slide on naloxone. This is an unavoidable conversation. To respond with the overwhelming risk of an opioid overdose that we see in Canada, particularly with powerful opioids like heroin and fentanyl, there's naloxone. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist. It is available as a nasal spray or an injectable. It is non-allergenic. You cannot have an allergic reaction to naloxone. Multiple doses can be given to a person without adverse effects. Now, naloxone offers temporary reversing of an opioid overdose. So if we go back to the slide on signs of overdose, this works to counteract a fentanyl, a heroin, a codeine, a morphine, an opioid overdose. This does not treat alcohol poisoning. This does not treat cannabis poisoning. This does not treat stimulant overdose. It is specific to opioids. But because we may not know if an individual has consumed opioids, if we find a situation where someone is unconscious, they've experienced weak or a loss of breathing, it is always helpful to administer opioid. It will not hurt them. The effects can last 20 to 90 minutes, but the effect of an opioid can be much longer. So it's still important that if you do ever have to administer naloxone, you still need to call emergency services. Now, some provinces offer free take-home naloxone kits, and we recommend that if you are considering having a party, if you're hosting, if you have teens, if you have someone that you know is using opioids or you suspect they may be, it's a great idea to have a naloxone kit in your house. I've heard people say that they wouldn't feel comfortable having naloxone in their house because they don't want to seem that they're permissive to opioid use. They're permissive to substance use. All you're doing is acknowledging it can happen. That would be like saying I have Band-Aids in my first aid kit. Does that mean I'm allowing people to get hurt in my house? Well, no. I have Band-Aids in my first aid kit because I acknowledge injuries happen. I have naloxone in my first aid kit because I acknowledge that overdoses can happen. I'm not saying I want them to happen. I'm not saying I'm welcoming people to use. It's not the conversation. The conversation is I want to help them. Make sure they stay safe. Which of these substances do Canadians aged 16 and above report mixing with cannabis at the highest rate? Is it stimulants, tobacco, hallucinogens, or alcohol? There is an answer here that is far and above all the others. Alcohol? Alcohol? Survey says the answer is alcohol. And about 63% report doing so either sometimes, often, or always. Now, if we go to just often or always, and sometimes like that heavier amount, it's around 40%, but another 23% say they do rarely, once in a while. Prom only happens once every year, so that would still fall in that situation. Even rare polysubstance use, rare mixing drugs together, does still expose an individual to risk. This is why a harm reduction strategy when it comes to mixing substances is to remind people if they're using drugs, if they're drinking, if they're using cannabis, if they're using cocaine, if they're using tobacco, if they're using sedatives, if they're using opioids, that they choose one drug and avoid mixing together. Because mixing these substances together can have adverse and in many cases catastrophic effects. We know that 1 in 8 Canadians over the age of 15 report mixing drugs together at least once in the last 12 months. Now, that's less than the majority, but that's still a fairly significant number. So what are some of the risks? Well, if we start with alcohol and cannabis, the first thing is to consider the risk of increased impairment, also known as greening out, right? Using cannabis can sometimes prevent the brain from realizing it's becoming impaired by other drugs, as well as cannabis. So what I mean by this is if a person smokes weed, if a person takes an edible, if a person takes a pull from a vape pen of THC, and then they start drinking, their body may not actually respond to the alcohol the way they normally would. This can lead a person to thinking that they're not impaired, which may cause them to drink more alcohol to try to feel certain effects, which increases the risk of alcohol poisoning. We also know both these drugs are diuretic. They can cause dehydration, so mixing them together increases the risk of migraine, headache, dizziness, weakness, stiffness, dry mouth, as well as many of the other unpleasant conditions of dehydration, including nausea and vomiting. Third thing to consider is hospitalization. Both substances increase the risk of impairment and poisoning, and these increase the risk of a need for emergency medical services. Mixing both together before driving increases the risk of a collision by up to 40 times. And finally, THC and CBD in low doses may be prescribed medically to an individual to prevent nausea and vomiting. However, if an individual consumes higher amount, these can cause nausea and vomiting. So mixing with alcohol increases the risk of nausea and vomiting. But if they've consumed low dose THC and it's acting as what's called an antiemetic that's preventing vomiting, if they're also experiencing alcohol poisoning, it can actually be harder for the body to expel or to vomit the alcohol, which can worsen their alcohol poisoning, which again is why it's recommended to avoid mixing these substances together. Now, if we mix cannabis with other drugs, these can cause unsafe changes to blood pressure, particularly things like stimulants. Certain medications don't mix well with cannabis, things like thyroid medication, heart medication, and birth control, as these can cause changes to blood pressure as well. So mixing with THC can have adverse effects there. So at a party, this can be a serious risk if a person mixes cannabis with stimulants or opioids, as this can cause dangerous spikes or valleys in their blood pressure, as well as cardiac episodes, even in teens and young adults. Again, we do see the possibility of psychotic episodes, particularly if they mix cannabis with other hallucinogens or stimulants. And we also see an increased risk of sedation or coma. Both cannabis and alcohol or opioids can slow down the brain's ability to react to situations, as well as its ability to react and send signals through the body, causing increased sleepiness, dizziness, and confusion. Mixing cannabis with fentanyl can increase the risk of a person falling unconscious, experiencing weak breathing, or even dying. It can also, in some research, actually complicate or slow the removal of fentanyl from the brain, which can extend the length of an overdose. So this can also, of course, increase the risk of fatality or hospitalization. Now, finally, what about alcohol or other drugs? Well, the first issue here is offsetting effects. Mixing a depressant like alcohol with a stimulant like cocaine or methamphetamine may cause offsetting effects. This may mean that a person doesn't feel as drunk as they normally would or as high as they normally would. They may misconceive this to believe that the substance isn't affecting them, when in reality it's still causing other adverse effects in the body. So they choose to consume more. Of course, this increases the risk of overintoxication and hospitalization. So it's important to remind a teen that just because they don't feel impaired, if they've consumed the substance, it is affecting them in some way, even if they don't recognize it. Mixing alcohol with other sedatives or opioids can increase the risk of shallow breathing and weak breathing, which can reduce heart rate, as well as mixing with opioids or other sedatives can cause this to fall to life-threatening levels. We know that alcohol poisoning can cause vomiting, and mixing with opioids can cause a person to pass out. This may increase the risk that a person vomits while unconscious and chokes to death due to being unable to clear the throat of the bile. And finally, we see an increased risk of coma and death. Alcohol and other depressants can complicate the effects of treatment for an opioid overdose, for instance. So it's important to remember when you're discussing substances with teens, with parties, with after parties, whatever have you, if they're choosing to use drugs, avoid mixing together and choose one at a time. Lots to cover on this slide. I got a presentation that goes way more in depth about this. I tried to sum it all up in like 5 minutes, but we can talk more about this another day. So mixing drugs and alcohol can be harmful, even fatal. So if you're concerned, you want to ask your teen, why do you think people might do this? What effects are they trying to feel? What responses are they trying to get? And what do you think might happen if you mix alcohol with cannabis, if you mix it with other drugs, if you mix cannabis with other drugs? And we invite these opportunities to have these conversations. That's why we talk about them today. Do you want to be willing to help? At the end of the day, whatever they say, whatever they know, you want to be willing to help. This comes back to what I said at the very beginning. You are there to support them. This is an opportunity to point out your willingness to do so. Last question, then we're going to wrap up for the day. If emergency medical services is called to treat a person for overdosing on drugs, the person will be charged for being impaired or for misdemeanor possession of a substance. Do you accept this, meaning you believe it's true? Do you challenge it, thinking you might question its validity? Last question. Other challenge. I see some votes here on challenge. Good Samaritan Act. Mindy and I have chatted about this before. I always like when I get the audience that knows this one. You want to challenge this one. All Canadians, including teens, are protected by the Good Samaritan Overdose Act. This offers some legal protection for those seeking help during an overdose. This is a conversation you can always have with teens. One of the biggest factors behind teens not calling emergency services is they don't want to get in trouble with their parents, but they don't want to get into legal trouble or get someone else into legal trouble. But because the risk of death is significant in the events of overdoses, particularly with opioids and alcohol, and sedatives as well, the Government of Canada in 2017, we know, signed into effect the Good Samaritan Overdose Act to offer some legal protection for things including misdemeanor possession and breach of conditions. Now, this means if a person calls for help and they have a small amount of a substance on them, or they've taken illegal or an illicit substance, they will not be charged for doing so. The job of the EMS, the role of the services, is to protect them. It is to save their life. It is to bring them back if they've overdosed. However, the Act does not protect against other crimes. This includes outstanding warrants, production or trafficking of drugs, or other crimes not included above. So if emergency services show up and they find a different crime being committed, those crimes can face legal ramifications. But this is to protect an individual in the case of an overdose. This is a very important conversation to have with teens. It is one that they need to understand fully so they know they can access these services. If your teen ever finds themselves in an emergency, you want to make sure they know how to identify an overdose, call 911, administer naloxone if necessary, and stay with the individual in need until help arrives. These are unfortunate realities that can happen on prom night. These are realities that can happen on any night. And because we know they can, this is why we invite these conversations. So, very last thing before we wrap up, we've talked about all of this today. It's just a quick reminder to sort of encapsulate what we've talked about. The safety starts with you as a provider. The safety starts with you as a healthcare provider, as an educator, as a parent, as a worker, as a youth worker, as a youth support. Ask questions, check in with your teens, offer compassion. When they're discussing prom, when they're discussing that party night they're going to, confirm the plans with them. Ask them their curfew, ask them their schedule, help them set that. Focus on safety. I had to talk about heavy topics today. I had to talk about worst case scenarios. I have to. But the focus is not on trying to scare them. It's about safety. What are the strategies we can use to reduce the risk of those happening? That's the focal point of the conversation. Be willing to help, even if drugs or alcohol are involved. And if you're hosting a party, particularly for teens, you do not want to be serving alcohol or drugs, and you want to keep naloxone on hand in case someone has used at a party. And for harm reduction, consider the reasons for use, designate a sober driver. And this can be the same whether you're talking with a teen or even having a conversation with your peers, even if someone here listening is using substances. We recommend you consider the factors that go into substance use. If you're traveling, always designate a sober driver, stay with people you trust, avoid mixing drugs, take breaks to hydrate, take breaks for food, take breaks to do other things that you enjoy. Do not take drinks from someone else that you don't trust. And know the signs of overdose. And this can be the same with other substances. Do not take drugs from someone you don't trust. Know the signs of overdose and call EMS or 911 as needed. Lots to cover. Now, I want to thank you all for joining us today. You were a wonderful audience. And the very last thing I'm going to do before we wrap up, I've got this sweet and wonderful post-workshop survey that I'm going to pop into the chat panel. Please take a moment to fill it in. It takes like 2 minutes. Usually how we make sure that our funders know that we've been covering our content. But if you are interested in learning more, you can visit our website at any time, drugfreekidscanada.org. We have resources there to support dialogue with family. We highlight various issues for substances, including opioids, vaping, DUI, steroids, bath salts, stimulants, opioids, OTC medications. You name it, you'll find it there. We have our Parent Support Hub, which I spoke about earlier. And all of these you can find online at drugfreekidscanada.org. Are there any questions while we're here today? I've also got a QR code if you're watching on your phone or have your phone. You can also do the survey there. Otherwise, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today. We certainly hope that you enjoyed the presentation. If you'd like to learn more, you can always visit our website, or like I said, you can always email me anytime if you ever want to see any of the presentation options that we offer in addition to our prom presentation. My email's there in the chat panel. And we hope that you enjoyed it. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. Oh, thank you. Appreciate all the positive comments. It's always so kind. I always like a nice audience. Oh, yeah, you can have the control back there, Susan, definitely. I think you can also end the recording too if you want there, Susan. I'm sticking around for a few minutes in case anyone had any questions. They were popping into the chat panel.